Thank you, Marwan. Thank you for having me. Basketball season hasn't started, so Father Kale guaranteed my security while I was here. And anyway, Syracuse is out of the Big East, but I gather we're going to still play every year or every other year. So we'll see on the court. And college sports and college experience for me in the United States was one of the great experiences of my life. I had learned a lot, and it's always a pleasure to come back to the U.S. and to come to universities, and I'm delighted with my association with Villanova for the last 2 years, and very happy to be able to talk to a wider audience of people from outside the university as well. And what I'd like to do is talk for maybe 25 minutes, maximum half an hour, and so that we can have more time for discussion and talk about issues in the Middle East that you'd like to raise that I may not be talking about. But the title of my talk is The Crises in Egypt and Syria, Democracy or Destruction in the Arab World, ? And we chose that title because there's so much going on in the Arab world in the last 2 years and 10 months since Mohammed Bouazizi set himself on fire on December 17, 2010 in the rural Tunisian town of Sidi Bouzid, which ignited sparked a series of rolling uprisings and revolutions and citizen revolts and all kinds of dynamism across the whole Arab world. And some countries ended up overthrowing their regimes. Some countries had wars, occupations, continuing fighting in Syria and other places. There's been such a tremendous variety of developments all across the Arab world, and every one of the 22 Arab countries has experienced something slightly different. So it's really hard to generalize, but we chose Egypt and Syria for two reasons. One, they capture really quite accurately this whole variety of events and experiences that have taken place in the Arab world in the last 2 years and 10 months. And also, what happens in Egypt and Syria historically really reflects what's going to happen in the rest of the region. These two countries and their capitals of Cairo and Damascus have been leaders and bellwethers and drivers of the entire Arab world in many, many ways. And I'm not talking just about the last 50 years or 100 years. I'm talking about the last 5,000 years. Damascus and Cairo have been major cities for about 5,000 years in different ways and in different configurations. Cairo was Fayoum and other different formats and configurations, but they were cities, they were centers of civilization. And as such, they're very important to understand. And in the modern world, they're the capitals of two powerful countries with very different trajectories. And now in the uprisings, these two countries have experienced very different trajectories, but in their different ways, they really are a good microcosm of everything that's going on in the region, the positive as well as the negative. And one of the important things for us to recognize is that there isn't a single linear process taking place in the Arab world. There are very complicated dynamics that are at the same time cyclical and sequential and simultaneous. In other words, there's things that are happening simultaneously all over the place at the same time. There are things that are happening sequentially, one after the other, in a rather orderly pattern. So they have a revolution, and they have a transitional government, and they have a constitutional committee to make a constitution. They have a referendum, they pass the constitution, they have an election, and then they go form a government. Everything happens neatly in a row in some cases. And they're cyclical, as we see in Egypt in particular. Things happen like I just described them, and then you have a government run by the Muslim Brothers. They're in power for a year, they fail miserably, they're totally incompetent, they get thrown out, and the cycle starts again. So you have a cyclical process, and these things go forwards and backwards. So you make a couple of steps forward, then you take a step backwards, so you have some good news, you have some bad news, So it's very hard to generalize about the region. But if we take Egypt and Syria, we can get a really good idea of what are the actual elements of progress, of historical change. We can start to get an idea of what has happened in the last almost 3 years in the Arab world that is meaningful, perhaps lasting, and significant, and what is just temporary and fleeting and inconsequential. And we can, again, start identifying some of this stuff, but we can't generalize and be absolutely definitive about it because it is such a dynamic and complicated process with so many dimensions to it. And these are very early days. I make the point often, if you heard me on the radio this morning, I make the point, democratic transitions take usually between 1 and 3 centuries. And in the case of the United States, you're now 2 1/3 centuries into your democratic transition, and you're still addressing issues of states' rights and federal rights, and do you need an ID card to vote? And you know, there are issues that are still being debated: the rights of gay and lesbian people, the rights of immigrants. So the democratization process never stops. It goes on continuously, especially in serious democracies that want to address their weaknesses while affirming their strengths. We've been doing this for 2 years and 10 months or so in a few Arab countries. Tunisia, Egypt, 2 years and a half maybe they've been actually at it. Very, very early days. And remember, if you go back to your own country in the United States, when you had your democracy, it was a historic moment of citizen sovereignty, never before achieved in the world. Constitutionalism built on the basis of pluralistic, democratic, republican principles of the consent of the governed, but black people didn't have any votes, didn't have any rights, women didn't have any rights, immigrants didn't have any rights, many minorities didn't have any rights. Those issues were dealt with a century or 2 centuries later, after you had a civil war and after you had campaigns, genocidal campaigns against Native Americans. There was a lot of ugly stuff that happened in the process of addressing the weaknesses of your democratic pluralism and then making that system work more equitably for everybody. And this is the same thing, I think, that we have to appreciate about the Arab world. We're in the very early stages. This is 1781 for us. I mean, you had your constitution in 1775, 1776. It didn't work very well. There was a big mess. And then 1789, you tried it again. It worked better. You had to add a whole bunch of amendments to the Constitution. It worked a little bit better. So it took you 13, 14 years just to get your Constitution right. We've only been doing it for 2.5 years. So I think a big dose of humility is really called for, and honesty and understanding the time it takes to get these kinds of things moving. So if anybody, if you read a columnist or hear somebody on TV saying something like, well, there was a good try in the Arab world and they tried to get democracy, it didn't work, the army's back in control, they're having civil wars, it's too bad, but it was a nice try. Well, just tell that person to please go back and read their American constitutional history and see how long it took the United States and how much violence happened in the United States to get that process worked out. I think we can make a few general comments that as you look across the region, despite the very different conditions in different countries, socioeconomic conditions, the nature of the government, the nature of the grievances that citizens express, and the extent of the legitimacy of the governments. They're all very different. So the Saudis, Kuwaitis, Jordanians, Moroccans, Egyptians, Somalis, everyone is different. But despite that, I think we can see a series of things that are common. In every country, without exception, citizens have been more willing to openly express their grievances, their complaints, and their aspirations in different ways. Sometimes they only do it on Twitter, because if they do it on the street, they're going to get thrown in jail or beaten up or killed. But most people are now not afraid to express their grievances and to express their aspirations. This is common all over the region. And what happens after people stop being acquiescent and docile and silent and marginalized and invisible people, once they start speaking out and expressing themselves and demanding their citizenship rights? What happens after that depends, now we can see more clearly, depends on a series of criteria across the region. And I'm just giving you this quick background, and then we'll get to Syria and Egypt as examples of this. The trajectory of the developments in each country will depend on several factors. One is the homogeneity of the society and the state. A country like Egypt or Tunis is much more homogeneous. The people are all pretty similar to each other. There's not huge differences, a little bit of religious differences, but they're pretty much homogeneous. So you look at a country like Iraq or Syria or Lebanon, it's much, much more varied. There's much less homogeneity. There's a lot of different people who found themselves suddenly part of a country that they didn't actually create themselves, created by retreating European colonial powers. So the degree of homogeneity of the state and the society will determine whether the transition is relatively smooth or relatively rough and violent. Second issue, I think, is the nature of the regime, the ruling power system. And that means, without exception, the nature of the armed forces and the security systems. Because all the Arab countries, without exception, are directly or indirectly managed or kept in place, sustained by the relationship between the executive authority and a series of military and security services, armed forces, intelligence agencies, police forces, many different security agencies. And how those ruling powers, let's call them, or just call them the regime, the security as well as the executive authority. It doesn't matter if it's a monarchy, if it's a republic, if it's something in between. How they behave will determine the trajectory. So in a country like Tunisia or Egypt, the challenge to the regime elicited a little bit of response, and then the regime collapsed. Not the leadership collapsed. The president of Tunis, the president of Egypt fled or resigned because their military wasn't going to fight to keep them in place. Whereas Libya or Syria or Bahrain, it's different. The military fought back. The regime fought back and killed its people in large numbers. So that issue makes a big difference. The third issue that matters is the nature and the experiences of the Islamists and the non-religious secular groups in society and the opposition. The Islamists emerged, meaning mainly Muslim Brotherhood type parties, mainstream, non-violent, social, political groups. The Muslim Brotherhood groups emerged very quickly as the leading opposition groups in many parts of the region for a lot of different reasons which we don't need to get into. But their experience in the years when they were under the thumb of the ruling powers in Egypt and Tunisia and Libya and other places, their experiences mattered a lot. So you look at Tunisia, or you look at Egypt, you look at Libya, you look at Syria, you see very different experiences. And when the Islamists were mistreated badly by their own regime, they were killed, they were tortured, they were put in jail for decades at a time, they came back in a rather violent way, like in Syria, like in Libya, and to some extent in Egypt. Whereas in Tunisia, the Islamists, or in Jordan even, the Islamists were not brutalized politically and physically by their governments. They were spent years in exile. The Tunisian and Nahda party leadership spent 20, 30 years in London. And they learned a lot from that experience. And so they came back with a different perception of how pluralistic, democratic, constitutional societies operate. And so the experience of the Islamists and the non-religious, the other opposition groups, in the last 30, 40 years makes a huge difference about what happens when these people actually either get into power or are part of a process of political transition. The fourth issue that I think makes a difference is the nature of civil society groups, non-governmental organizations, human rights societies, women's groups, labor unions, the whole range of non-governmental organizations. The nature of those institutions, their credibility, their depth, their experience, and particularly their ability to do two things: to function politically, to function in the context of politics. And this is critically important because one of the new things that's happened in the Arab world is the birth of a political sphere, which I'll get into in a minute. But if nobody has the experience how to act politically, how to engage, how to mobilize, how to get out the vote, how to market themselves, how to make compromises, how to make deals, how to make coalitions, how to cajole or even threaten, but peacefully, non-violently threaten politically, like you just saw them doing in Washington for quite a while, threatening each other, but non-violently and politically, and even withdraw from the system. If the civil society groups are able to act politically and act when needed as mediators between the Islamists and the military regimes, that will determine what kind of transition takes place. And finally, the fifth issue that impacts how each country makes a transition is the kind and the degree and the longevity of external intervention. And by external intervention, I mean regional powers like Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, one or two others, but they're the main ones, or global powers, the US, Russia, China, the Europeans, different ones. How those external actors intervene in different countries makes a huge difference to what actually happens in those countries. In Tunisia and Egypt, you didn't have any significant external intervention in the beginning, and therefore they had a relatively normal, as expected, as normal as can be expected, transition, which worked in some areas and didn't work in others. Whereas in Libya, you had NATO attacking and a war took place. In Syria, you had everybody in the world sending troops and money and guns and political support to fight the biggest proxy war, as I called it in my op-ed today, the biggest proxy war of modern times. And there was massive external intervention in Syria, which is why this war is so violent. In Libya, you had the Saudis and some of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries moving in with their troops, small, low intensity, I wouldn't call it invasion, but low intensity movement into Bahrain, according to the GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council self-defense agreement, mutual defense agreement. So what they did, what the Saudis went into Bahrain with their troops to keep the peace and keep the regime in place, it was seen by them to be a perfectly legitimate move. Most of the rest of the world thought it was rather aggressive and predatory, but by the perceptions of the Saudis and the GCC, it was a perfectly legitimate move. But the point is that that external military intervention made a huge difference, as does, say, the Iranian and Hezbollah intervention in Syria as well. So those 5 issues will really, so far we can see from actual experience, we can see the factors that will determine what happens in each of these countries. The second point I'd make is that if you look at Syria and Egypt, you see very different trajectories of change, and they show that there's a tendency to both democracy or democratic, the beginnings of democratic transformations, or the building blocks of democratic transformation are starting to take place or take shape in some places or take root. But at the same time, you have destruction, you have violence, you have shattering of society, fragmentation of society. But also, we're seeing a third way, a third consequence, which is in both Syria and Egypt and other countries, which is the possible capacity of both society as a whole and political culture to remain static to a large extent and to change only superficially. So if you look at Egypt today, after 2 years and 10 months or so, the army is in control. The armed forces appoints the cabinet, temporary cabinet. They dominate the whole political system. They decide who goes to jail, who doesn't go to jail. They decide to ban the Muslim Brothers. So what's changed in Egypt between now and Hosni Mubarak in the last 50, 60 years, 60 years of military rule since 1952? You can argue, well, not much. I would argue that there has been change. But there's also a view that says, well, the change is very superficial. So it's too early to tell. But what we're seeing are signs of democratic building blocks, signs of destruction and failure, and signs of something in between where you're getting possibly a liberalization of autocratic systems that are slowly liberalizing. And possibly we might be seeing in Egypt the emergence of something that we saw in Turkey in the last 20 years, which is military rule that very gradually, through democratic elections at the local level and other governorate level and national level, very slowly possibly may allow a real democratic process to take place, which, as happened in Turkey, 20 years later, the civilians take control of society. The elected civilian authorities control the power structure and have oversight over the military, and the military goes back to the barracks and does its job, which is to protect the country, not to protect the regime only. So we may be seeing the emergence of that third force. But we see more importantly, I think, on a general level, we see clearly the different varieties and the different options of the two most important forces that define the Arab world today and probably have defined it in the last 30 years, 40 years, maybe a generation and a half. And those are the Islamist groups and their social group, economic groups, cultural groups, religious groups, military groups. Some of them are terror groups, but most of them are not terror. Most of them are nonviolent, but the Qaeda type ones are terror groups. So there's a whole range of different groups that use religion, Islamic religion, because that's the dominant religion there. There's a very wide variety of these groups, which is much more clear now than it was 3 years ago. We didn't know, for instance, the strength of the Salafist groups. They won 20% in Egypt. These groups emerged almost out of nowhere. They were there in society, but they were working at the community level, but they became a national political force. The Qaeda type Salafist Takfiri groups, the ones emerging in Syria now more powerfully in different places, and they came very much from Iraq in the post-American British invasion of Iraq. When Iraq became a wasteland and a land of chaos, it created an opportunity for these Qaeda type groups to take root and to do their dirty deeds, and they've now spread much more into Syria. So there's tens of thousands of these violent groups, and they again are a relatively new phenomenon on a big scale in the Arab world. So what we see more clearly is this whole range of Islamist groups, and on the other side we see the whole range of the military security traditional regime groups. And the reality so far in the last almost 2 years is that both of them have had an opportunity to exercise power. And again, Egypt is the best example. The military ran Egypt for the first year and a half almost of the transition after Mubarak fell. They're now back in power again, doing another transition. And the Muslim Brotherhood in between were in control for about a year and a half, something like that. And the reality is that both of them failed very badly. The armed forces and the Muslim Brotherhood have both proved to have strong support in society, deep anchorage among their population, but both proved to be totally incompetent in managing the affairs of state. And this is I think, a very positive experience in the sense that it's good we went through this process. So we know now, don't bring in the military to run your society. Don't bring in the Muslim Brothers to run your society, because neither of them know how to do it. And both of them will try to do the same thing, which they try to do in various places, which is to get absolute power, immunize themselves from accountability and oversight from the constitutional authorities, put their people in positions of authority and power and influence, and try to stay in power for a long time. Both the Islamists and the military have tried to do that. And in both cases, they got strong pushback from society. And that's the most important thing to me, the strong pushback from society against the military and against the Muslim Brothers when those two powerful groups were seen to go too far, were seen to try to monopolize power and recreate the old autocratic regime. What we haven't seen, amidst the failure of the Muslim Brothers and the armed forces to govern efficiently, what we haven't seen is the emergence of that third group that has to ultimately emerge, as it did in Turkey and it did in other democratic countries, a third group of people who behave, who act politically, who mobilize support, who win power legitimately through elections, and who govern efficiently and democratically. One of the problems of both the army and the Muslim Brothers is they were in authority legitimately for various periods of time with the consent of the governed, with the approval of the population, but neither of them were really inclusive. Neither of them really allowed other people to participate and to compete for power in a fully open system. They both tried to control the system to their advantage. So let's look very briefly at Egypt and let's look at Syria. So what do we see in Egypt over the last 2 years and 10 months? We see, I think, the very erratic and weak but clear early stages of the building blocks of democratic pluralism. And what do I mean by that? What are those early little faint lights, small little budding building blocks? We see the emergence of citizens. We see individual men and women numbered in the tens of millions of individuals who feel that they're citizens. And what do I mean by that? They feel that they have rights as citizens, and more importantly, they feel now, unlike 20 years ago, and 10 years ago, and 30 years ago, when they didn't express this, but now they express it, they feel that not only do they have their rights, but they also feel that they have the ability to implement those rights, to make their governments change so that they can enjoy the rights of citizenship. Equality, opportunity, due process, whatever all the different things, human rights, freedoms of speech, of this, of that. So citizenship is starting to happen. You're seeing the birth, very clearly, no ambiguity on this at all, the birth of a public political sphere. A public political sphere in which you have glorious things like elections, referenda, campaigns, free speech, and you have really awful things like people beating each other up, the army closing newspapers, banning Muslim Brothers, intimidating people intimidating each other. You have all kinds of good and bad things happening. And if you think back to the early days of your own democracy in the 1800s, you had similar things like that happen in big city politics in many cities around the United States or in Europe. This is a normal function of the early stages of any kind of democratic transition, but there is this public political sphere now. And it's a public political sphere where individuals or groups can act, engage each other, and vie for power, and try to get elected and to try to get into power democratically and legitimately. Part of that public political sphere and the contestation of power that's taking place is also working to create a new social contract. And you see this much more clearly in Tunisia, because they're more advanced, but you see it in Egypt through the writing of the Constitution. Both the first time they did it, a year and a half ago, and now the second time that it's being done. And whether this group of 50 people writing the Constitution in Egypt today is really legitimate or not, you might argue, well, these guys were chosen by the army, so we can't take them seriously. That's really irrelevant. What they're actually discussing, and what the other group was discussing a year and a half ago, is the important point. That they're grappling with the core issues that define any country and society. Identity, rights, limits of power, accountability, pluralism, core issues that define the country and the society and the political system. And deeply embedded in this quest for a new social contract is the attempt, still very weak, but the attempt to implement principles of social justice, which was one of the driving forces of these revolutions and still is. If you listen to community groups and grassroots organizations and non-governmental organizations today who are working on these issues, the quest for social justice is a very central demand, but is still very weak in terms of being voiced or implemented. Another building block is you see people trying to create the institutions and instruments of the rule of law. And the constitutional process, again, is the way to do this, is the attempt to do this. And it's working better in Tunisia. Most of these things are working better in Tunisia than in Egypt. But Egypt is the more important place because it's such a big influence on the whole region. And in Egypt, there is still this dogged determination to try to create mechanisms of governance based on the rule of law. And that includes a desire to have democratic pluralism enshrined in the Constitution, that you can't just have the Muslim Brothers or the army determine who can be in the political system and who's banned from the political system. You can't have just one group. That has to come out of a pluralistic consensus in society, which is what the Constitution is all about. And the emphasis placed on the Constitution is so strong because it reflects the desire of citizens to enshrine these gains and to achieve these goals and these rights through a constitution that really matters, that really is implemented. Not like the old constitutions that on paper said everybody has equal rights, everybody has equal opportunity, but in fact were not implemented. And finally, what we're seeing, I believe, is again the very early stages of the birth of legitimate public authority within a national consensus. It hasn't happened yet. We haven't achieved it yet. But the attempt to do this in Egypt is, I believe, very impressive, very real, very persistent. They won't give up. We're now in a setback with the army throwing out the Muslim Brothers, putting them in jail, with a lot of support from the public, but this is a temporary phase. There's no doubt about it. Because tens of millions of people a year and a half ago wanted nothing more than to have the army finish its initial transition and get back to the barracks and let the elected civilian authorities run the country. Those sentiments are still there, but people were so scared by what the Muslim Brothers were doing in terms of their incompetence, lack of security, deteriorating security conditions, economic regression, lack of benzene and gasoline, lack of heating oil, electricity cutoffs, food deliveries were erratic. People were so frightened by the consequences of the incompetence of the 1 year of Muslim Brotherhood governance that they panicked and said, look, let the army come back and just get things right again, and then we'll try this again. So this is a short-term regression in which you have public support for the armed forces, and people trust the armed forces, but they don't want the armed forces to rule. And I think you'll see in a couple of months very clearly new expressions of popular demands that the armed forces push this transition faster and let the civilian authorities take over. And the year that the Islamists had power and ruled and failed, I think, is a very important year. That experiment, it wasn't an experiment, but that experience was very important. You had to let the Islamists run the country because they were elected, they won legitimately, and they failed very badly, and they lost a lot of support. And they got 51% in the presidential election. They probably now have about 15–20% support among the population because people tried them and they were incompetent. But they still have a strong core of support. So it creates a whole new environment. For the next set of elections and referenda, people will vote in a much more rational way rather than emotionally as they did before. So that's Egypt. Look at Syria. What do you see in Syria? You see a series of things that also reflect a lot of the trends across much of the region. You see a hard security response by the regime. In Egypt, you saw a soft security response, but the military would not shoot its own people, and they told Mubarak 3 years ago, they told Mubarak, we're not going to shoot our people to keep you in power, and then Mubarak had to step down. Now, in Syria, you've seen a hard security response where the regime quickly fought back and was shooting its own people and trying to put down the rebellion, the peaceful rebellion, the peaceful demonstrations by any means. And it didn't work because the more that the regime shot back against its own people, the harder that they demonstrated to get the regime changed. You also see in Syria sectarian violence, a rise in sectarianism, Alawites, Sunnis, Christians, Druze, Kurds, different groups within the country retreating into their own sectarian, ethnic, national identity because the state, the country, was not able to protect them, was not able to give them their rights, was not able to deliver the services they expect, electricity, water, education, healthcare. So they have to get these things from somewhere else. They get them from their subnational units that they belong to. Your religion, your ethnic identity, your neighborhood, your region, whatever. And you see this fragmentation of the country along sectarian lines, as well as the use of violence by sectarian groups, the two things happening simultaneously. You see the process of significant external intervention in Syria. Iran, the US, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Russia, many people intervening diplomatically, politically, militarily, aid, even with fighters, some people sending fighters. And part of this is the emergence in Syria of these Salafi, Takfiri groups, the Al-Qaeda type Islamist groups. And they've grown quite significantly, so there's probably 20 or 30,000 of these people now. Many of them are soft Salafists. They're fighting for various reasons now. Some of them because they get money, some of them because it's solidarity with their friends, some of them because they think it's a route to power, and some of them because they're genuinely motivated by their ideology. But not all of these people are diehard, lifelong ideologues or militants committed to these groups. But for the moment, these groups have grown, and they are a sign of a trend that you can see across the region. And many of them in Syria have come from other Arab countries or even from further afield, including from Chechnya, from Pakistan, from Western Europe, even a few. You see significant leakages and linkages across the borders of Syria. The state system in the Levant, in the West Asia, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, that state system is seeing the borders between them gradually fading. They're still there, but there's huge leakage across these borders. Refugees, soldiers, fighters, money, drugs, smuggling people, armaments, food supplies, whatever, completely without the control of the sovereign governments. And this reflects the slow fragmentation of the centralized state. The former strong centralized security state that Syria was is changing very quickly. And you saw this, you see it in Libya, you see it in Yemen, you see it in many other countries around the region. And as the state withdraws, pulls in, and retreats from areas, other people take control of those areas, and you end up with a patchwork of sectarian, religious, ethnic, national, and sometimes criminal groups, terror groups, who are taking over these places from where the state retreated. So you see in Syria this whole range of really pretty negative developments that are seen in many other parts of the region, but not quite to the same extent as you see them happening altogether in Syria. And this contrasts very significantly with what you see in Egypt, which I just described, a much more rational process of people trying over and over and over again to get a constitutional, democratic, pluralistic transition achieved. And they're still moving forward, but they move forward 2 steps, they move back 1 step, and it's inconsistent. So I'll end by saying, what are the lessons to date across the region? What can we say by analyzing the actual events on the ground, rather than trying to imagine what these people are like over there and what these Arabs and Muslims and others are trying to do? We can now analyze what they've actually done. We can judge these societies on the basis of their real lived experience, rather than any kind of Orientalist imagination of what they're like, which used to be the case before. The lessons to date, I think, are 4, I'd mention quickly. 1 is that there's no clarity, there still is no clarity, and this is no surprise because the period is very short, as I said. There's no clarity on the 3 critical I's, the letter I: identity, ideology, and the institutions of state. Identity, meaning religious, tribal, ethnic, national, supranational, Arab identity, Islamic identity, tribe, ethnicity, Kurdish, Druze, Christian, Bani Hamida tribe, Bani Hussein tribe, Bani something or other tribe. So the identity issues are still very, very fluid and unclear. The ideology issues are very unclear in the political systems, in the national systems, and the institutions of state. Will we get stable democracies, real parliaments, division of power, checks and balances, accountability, pluralism, opportunity for all, independent judiciary, consent of the governed? It's not clear. It is clear that people want to do this, and you'll probably see it starting to happen in Tunisia in the next 3-4 months, and Egypt, I hope, but it's not clear. The second point is the key balances that have to be shaped for these societies to make their transitions. Those key balances continue to be also unclear. The 2 most important ones are the balance between military and civilian power, military and civilian authority, and between secular and religious identity and power in society. And it's not clear which way those balances are going to tip. Will these societies have more Islamic identity, more secular identity, more tribal identity, more, will the military have more power, the civilians, or will there be some point in between? And each country will be different. The third point is, I believe that we can say accurately that the majority of citizens in these countries across the region, especially the ones that have experienced uprisings like Yemen and Bahrain and Syria, etc., North Africans, the majority of these citizens are pushing for democratic change that they want to achieve, but they have not been able to harness those forces of citizen sovereignty to be able to bring that change about. They're disorganized, they're not mobilized, they're not focused, and you see this very clearly in the opposition in Egypt, and you certainly see it in the opposition in Syria, where there's all kinds of different groups, and they simply cannot get together, harness that power, and bring about the change. And the last point, which is what you see in Egypt today with the military in power again, and seemingly, well, not seemingly, supported by a large number of Egyptians, probably a majority, small majority. But what you see is a struggle among individual citizens and among their entire society between their desire for efficiency and efficacy and the delivery of the basic services that they want, security, healthcare, jobs, income, food, gasoline, those things, efficiency and efficacy in those basic human needs on the one side, and on the other side, the legitimacy of the exercise of power. So what do you want? If you want reasonably priced bread, safe streets, good hospital, decent hospital care, or whatever hospital care you have, then you say, fine, let the army come back and rule, and I can wait for my democratic rights. Or do you say, no, I'll put up with problems in my daily life if I have the dignity of being a human being that's treated like a human being by my own power structure. In other words, we're still at the moment that Mohammed Bouazizi was when he set himself on fire on December 17, 2010. When he was deprived of his material rights to sell his fruits and vegetables by the police lady who stopped him from selling, and when he went to the governor's office to complain, he was ignored and he was deprived of his political rights. He had neither political rights nor material rights, and he had no reason to live. He set himself on fire. The difference now is that people in most of these Arab countries, especially the ones that have started to make the changes like in North Africa, they feel that they have the opportunity to actually bring these things about. And they're involved in processes of change that are erratic, occasionally violent, mostly peaceful, inconsistent, forwards and backwards, a little bit messy, chaotic, but these processes are taking place. They're sitting in Tunisia and Egypt and Libya and Yemen discussing constitutions, power sharing, etc., etc. That's the difference between Mohammed Bouazizi and the people of the Arab world, most of the people of the Arab world today. So the bottom line, I believe that we can see a clear desire and the very beginnings of the actual implementation of early building blocks of democratic pluralism, which will allow people in the Arab world, if they succeed, and they will succeed in some countries and they will not succeed in others, but if they succeed, they will start on the road to the ultimate prize, which is self-determination and genuine sovereignty. Thank you very much.